All right, we are back. Welcome to When Women Stood, and this is Women's Sports History. My name is Alexandra Allred, and I am with the Department of Kinesiology at Tarleton State University. So let's just jump in. And as always, the book is your absolute reference point. I am merely jumping through history probably a little too quickly, but we need to just to kind of keep things rolling. But this is the beginning of Title IX and the Battle of the Sexes. So really into the late 1950s and early 1960s, a lot of things were happening. Rosa Parks refusing to stand up, and that causing the bus boycott and the assassination of Martin Luther King and JFK. The Civil Rights Act passed, and it's important to note that really it passed after the assassination of both of these leaders, or Martin Luther King really set up the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and I think that we don't talk about that enough. He really transcended his well-known speeches and his activism while he was living. He was a larger-than-life character in our history. Also the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and of course the Marathon Woman. And that one is really important because women were running. They were always running, but they weren't allowed to, and there was no Title IX, and so there was no opportunity to run. And Catherine Switzer, who you see in the picture, Catherine Switzer was a runner. She wanted to run, and so because there was no female track teams in any colleges, she went to her university's male track team and asked the coach if she could just run with them. And she was such a phenomenal runner that she developed a relationship with the coach. He really respected her, and so he told her if she could run, he'd run with her. So they entered the Boston Marathon. She didn't do anything illegal. She just put her initials. Wasn't trying to hide the fact that she was a female, but she got her bid, entered the race. And as they were running the Boston Marathon, it was in the 30s that morning. She had been layered, but she began to shed her layers as all the runners did. And the media truck realized there's a woman. And they got so excited that they followed along with her. When word got back to one of the organizers of the race, he was so livid that there was no way he was going to have a woman in his race. That, as you can see in the picture, and there's a series of pictures you can find online, but in the book, he was attacking her. He was determined that he was going to pull the bib off of her and he was going to drag her out of the race. And in the picture, you also see that her boyfriend just happened to be an All-American football player. And so he and several others fought this guy off of Catherine, and she was able to finish the race, which of course was a huge deal, and it was a big multimedia event. But the very fact that he would attack this woman anyway, but he attacked her literally in front of more than a dozen cameramen. This is just how strong those feelings were. About this same time, Bernice Sandler, who was also in education, had really seen her fair share of sexual harassment, discrimination. She continuously was passed over for promotions because she was told that she was too abrupt. You know, for a woman, she was just too abrupt. Even though she said she had the same skill sets as the men around her, but when she exhibited those same kind of leadership skills, then she was pushy, domineering, abrasive, hard to get along with. So anyway, she found in the passage of Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, you can see on the screen there all the rights that people were given. There wasn't anything that included discrimination for people in education, which goes to why women like Catherine Switzer were forced to run with or compete alongside men's teams just for fun if the coaches allowed them. So Sandler found this loophole in the Title VII Act, and so she was able to determine that it said that there couldn't be discrimination that included federal agencies. Well, that was higher education. So that was what she needed, and she connected with Representative Edith Green and Representative Patsy Mink, and together they made history, and they were able to pass not only the Title IX, but also they revised the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, to make sure, and I love this quote, an important step for the effort of women to provide women in America something that's rightfully theirs. So this was really the beginning of recognizing that women had been ignored in the legal system, and it was time to change that. It was passed into law in 1972 by President Nixon, and not 15 months later was probably at the time, it was the biggest sporting event. More than 50 million Americans were watchers. An estimated 90 million people worldwide watched the sporting event. The two tennis greats competed against each other. And, arguably in real life, Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King were good friends. But Bobby Riggs saw this as a great opportunity for PR. And so he said horribly chauvinistic, misogynistic things. I didn't even bother to put them in the slides. You can look it up and it's in the book. But it turned into the battle of the sexes. And people were betting. I mean, this was a huge deal. There were T-shirts, and this is pre-internet, and it was the most massive thing that anybody could remember in any time frame. And it was all over the news, all over. It was headline news everywhere, not just in the United States, but around the world. And ultimately, Billie Jean King did win. This was such a win for everyone. Women actually were so excited, and previously they'd been, even though now it had become law, too many women stayed silent about sexual harassment, sexual assault, discrimination in the workplace and in education because they were afraid that what they just got could be taken away from them. And so too many stayed quiet. But when Billie Jean King won, that really empowered and emboldened so many athletes, including the rowing team of Yale. And so at Yale, the men and women rowers, they practiced together, but after practice, when everybody was sopping wet and cold, there was one locker room for the men, and they would go in there and take their time, take warm showers and change to be bused back to the campus, while the women had to sit on the bus, wet, shivering cold, and sometimes getting sick. And they finally had enough, and so they staged this event in which they walked into the the head of the fitness department, and they were naked. And when they walked in, that, again, the media jumped all over this because these were new images of women that the world had never seen before. Media was suddenly becoming more important to women than ever before, and women finally realized we're going to have to run this ship ourselves. If we want to change the way that we're presented, we're going to have to start stepping up into the world of media. And that's where Gloria Steinem came in. Gloria Steinem, with Dorothy Hughes, they started Ms. Magazine. And again, more details in the book, but they literally would have people throw things back in their face, spit on the magazine. They were outraged that a magazine was going to start that didn't focus solely on pleasing your man and wearing makeup and being beautiful. They wanted Ms. Magazine to include how to change the oil in your car, and how to be more independent, looking for jobs and higher education. And so this was a real fight. We had more. The Freedom Forum was Nancy Woodall started the Freedom Forum. She was the first female of USA Today, publishing world, USA Today. In the Feminine Mystique was written by Betty Friedan, who's widely known as the mother of modern feminism. So there was huge things happening, and it's crazy to think. It really started with a woman running a marathon, and then the passage of Title IX, a tennis match, and some of these sporting events that really began to show that women had the power to speak up. But the world was starting to see that women were economically viable in sport and as well as education. So I'll move me here, but so we see that by 1972, a gymnast named Nadia Comaneci just wowed the world. And at the same time, but the media really glommed onto her because she was still in the arena where women belonged, gymnastics, dance, something that was more feminine, even though we know how incredibly difficult gymnastics is. It was considered a proper feminine sport. But meanwhile, roller derby, surfing, jockeys in the Kentucky Derby, weightlifting and race car driving were starting to become more and more popular. And it's important to note too that Catherine Switzer was not the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. Other women were running the marathon, but they usually did it in disguise, or they didn't sign up, and so everybody just ignored them. Well, it's crazy to think that it wasn't until 1982 that the first prototypes for running shoes came about for women. And I put in this picture because Roberta Gibb was unofficially ran the marathon even before Catherine Switzer, but she ran in her nursing shoes. Imagine running 26.2 miles in nursing shoes. And I think in this race she wore her brother's boys' shoes, but she trained in her nursing shoes, which is just incredible. But women, they did what they had to do, and they used what they could get their hands on. And it wasn't until 1977 that the sports bra was set up. And today it created let me move this so you can see, but it created the $25 billion industry, that is today for women's sports bras. So, the story of Bev Francis and Rachel McClish. And so in the early 80s, there had been a movie called Pumping Iron with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Lou Ferrigno. It was a huge success. And so the producer wanted to do a second movie with women. And this was still a novelty. Women competitively lifting weights was really a rare and interesting, we'll put it that way, thing for a lot of people. But this movie really changed things, not because of how great the athletes were, but because of the controversy that swirled around this movie. And at the end result, you'll see, so the cover, the Pumping Iron to the women, that's Rachel McClish. And she actually, even though she came in, third place, she was on the cover because she was the vixen. She was the beauty queen of the event. But what caused the commotion was Bev Francis from Australia, who was a well-known power lifter who got into bodybuilding. She didn't actively pursue this. She was begged to come and do this because the producer really wanted to have that, the vixen, the beauty versus the beast. And that's actually many used the title, that was the beauty versus the beast many times. But Bev Francis, she often said that she really should have been first or last, because when they talked about the beauty of the symmetry in bodybuilding, it had been said that they would be judged the same way that the men were, but in the end, it became more of a beauty pageant. And so she always said that she should have been first or last, because she was, with her own words, she was the least beautiful woman out there, or she should have been first if they were judging it as they did with the men with the symmetry and the muscle and the lines and everything that went into it. So that was I really urge you guys to look into that and even to watch the movie. It's really compelling. The other thing that came from that was the obvious push to have implants. And because if you're going to be beautiful, you need to have breast implants. And that was a real push that at that point you really couldn't be successful in women's bodybuilding without that. The other thing that happened that really showed, again, there was Nadia Comaneci, there was the battle of the sexes, but in the Olympic Games, yet another huge event that happened that showed that women were exciting. And we've talked about this before, that a lot of people will say, well, women's sports just isn't that exciting. If you go through the records, some of the most viewed and most popular ever sporting events were between women. And what was going down with that. And this is a perfect example. In 1984, the IOC was still arguing whether having women in the Olympic Games was even worth it for the Games. Flash forward today, women bring in and are more economically lucrative for the IOC than men across the board. But 1984 was a big deal because there was a runner named Zola Budd from South Africa, and this is when there was still apartheid. And she was tearing up the records. And she was definitely going to be making, she was going to make the Olympics, but she was looking at chasing down her idol, Mary Deckler, and getting the gold. The problem was she knew that she was never going to be allowed in the Olympics as a South African, so her family moved to Great Britain. She became a citizen and she ran under the Great Britain's flag. And so this was said to be the biggest fall in sports. And it was a trip. It was accidental. But at the last minute, Zola, who always was famous for running barefooted, she went for it. She made her pass, and as she did, they clipped heels. And you can see in the picture as Mary goes down, there's nothing that she can do. And actually Zola runs for a little bit longer, and then when she looks back and she sees her idol has gone down and she realizes that it was her fault, she just collapses on the field into tears because this was not how she dreamt of Olympic glory. And she was wanting gold, but she would have settled for silver. And this turned out to be one of the most talked about event in the 1984 games, and even the following games, because they kept talking about, remember that fall, and anytime there was some tightness and competition between female athletes. But nothing could compare to the decade later, the 1994 Lillehammer Games between Nancy Kerrigan and Tonya Harding, in which, as Nancy was cutting off the ice after a practice, she was attacked by a man with, we believe, a crowbar, who whacked her knee. And there just happened to be a film crew there because they were going to interview Kerrigan. And as she was screaming, crying, why, there were people who, move me again. There were people again who, the first thing they said was, where's Tonya? Because everybody knew that probably Tonya was the one that was responsible for someone trying to take out Kerrigan. And as it happens, it was her husband. And so I'll let you read more about how they determined that it would be okay to let Tonya go back into the race, but or the competition. But it was here it is right here. Despite the event airing in the afternoon in the United States, it was the third most watched sporting event in television history and the sixth most of all time. That means not including the sixth of all time. There were so many reporters and photographers around the world to come just to watch the practice session. These are the pictures from the practice session, that they had to get added security to try to manage the crowd who wanted to come in just to watch practice. And then, of course, there was FloJo. Florence Griffith Joyner, widely considered one of the greatest runners of all time, but it's not without scandal because she was connected to a large doping scandal, and she died at a very young age of a stroke in her sleep. And while the autopsy shows that it was not steroid related, the controversy still swirls, and there are many athletes today who don't recognize FloJo's records that she set because they believe that she was cheating. And one of the most significant things, and she was famous for her hair, her style, the one-legged, but also her nails. And she was hugely popular. But she also is rarely recognized, where she changed the style of the NBA and their jerseys, and it started with the Indiana Pacers. But eventually if you go back in time, you see the short shorts and the tighter jerseys, and now you've got the long shorts and the loose fitting. That was FloJo. So just an incredible woman in history. I have here on the top, I am a fan of FloJo's, but I recognize that there's a lot of back history with the connections that she had. One of the biggest ones is that at the games in BC was going to run a side-by-side of FloJo when she was first breaking records, and then when she was at the game, then an NBC official said that the radical transformation of her appearance was so great that they were afraid of what that would do back in the United States, and so they did not run that footage, which is pretty crazy. And then, of course, there's her information about movie so that you can look back on that later if you like. And then the shoes. The shoes have always been, and so you think Air Swoops, which was Cheryl Swoops. Lisa Leslie had a shoe. To this day, a lot of people don't know that it was Gabrielle Reese shoe line that actually outsold the Air Jordans. But the big thing about this is even though these women started getting their own shoes, a lot of times these athletes still had to wear men's shoes in competition because they had a difficult time getting their own shoe to compete in. 1993, women got into boxing, and Christy Martin really came onto the scene with one of the more bloody battles that anyone had ever seen on television with two women boxing. But it was a bit, and then we look at MMA today and women's boxing with Clarissa Shields and Ronda Rousey and some of the big greats that we have today. But I go through these because I want you guys to realize just how much fighting, no pun intended, women had to go through. Their PMS was used against them as boxers to be able to get into and do the sports that they wanted to do. So we're going to end with, the questions that are really kind of good to ask ourselves as we move into modern history. The big why, I mean, you can look at the list of questions, but the biggest why is just, why did this have to be so hard? And we're going to talk about that again as we get into modern sports and we look at how challenging it still is even today, different reasons, but the challenge still continues. So that is it. I will leave you with that, and we are moving on to the next section.